Case 1. Lee Boyd Malvo. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 24, 2002, heavily armed tactical officers surrounded a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice sedan parked quietly at a rest stop along Interstate 70 in Frederick County, Maryland. Inside the vehicle, two figures slept, unaware that hundreds of federal agents and state troopers had spent the last 3 weeks pursuing them across multiple state lines. When law enforcement smashed the car windows and extracted the occupants, they did not just end a reign of terror that had gripped the nation's capital. They uncovered an elaborate mobile sniper post designed specifically to inflict maximum fear while leaving virtually no trace behind. The teenager pulled from that backseat was 17-year-old Lee Boyd Malvo. Alongside him was 41-year-old John Allen Mohammed. Within hours of their capture, investigators realized that this high-profile arrest concluded one of the most complex, multi-jurisdictional manhunts in American history, leading directly to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole for the young gunman. To understand how a 17-year-old boy became an integral part of a coordinated campaign of violence, we have to go back to where his journey began. Born in Jamaica in 1985, Lee Boyd Malvo grew up in an unstable environment characterized by extreme poverty, parental abandonment, and constant relocation between Jamaica and Antigua. By 2001, 16-year-old Malvo found himself isolated, homeless, and searching for identity in Antigua. It was there that he crossed paths with John Allen Mohammed, a former United States Army veteran who was estranged from his family and living under an assumed identity. Mohammed recognized the teenager's deep vulnerability and step by step inserted himself into Malvo's life, filling the role of a surrogate father. Over the next year, Mohammed systematically isolated Malvo from his mother, brainwashed him with intense military-style discipline, and reshaped his worldview through rigorous physical conditioning and ideological indoctrination. Malvo was stripped of his independent agency and transformed into a fiercely loyal operative who viewed Mohammed as an infallible leader. Under Mohammed's strict guidance, Malvo was introduced to tactical marksmanship and covert operations. What the public later perceived as a sudden, isolated outbreak of violence in late 2002 was actually the culmination of a months-long, multi-state dry run. In early 2002, long before the pair arrived in the Washington metropolitan area, they launched a preliminary cross-country campaign designed to test their equipment, refine their methods, and establish their operational blueprint. Their trail of violent incidents stretched across Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama. In February 2002, a shooting at a golf course in Tucson left a woman severely injured. Months later, in September 2002, an armed robbery at a liquor store in Montgomery, Alabama, resulted in a fatal shooting. At every stop, the pair vanished long before local authorities could piece together a connection between the seemingly random events, gradually building the psychological momentum that would culminate in October. The psychological dynamic between the two was defined by total authority and compliance. Malvo's psychological dependence on Mohammed created a mindset where orders were executed without hesitation or moral reservation. Every tactical decision, from target selection to escape routes, was calculated to maximize panic and paralyze entire communities. By early autumn 2002, the pair implemented their most sophisticated technical setup inside the blue Chevrolet Caprice. They modified the vehicle's interior by removing the rear seat support structure and cutting a precise, circular porthole through the trunk lid near the license plate frame. The fuel tank area and trunk interior were lined with dark material, creating a completely concealed, sound-dampened firing position from which a shooter could lie prone inside the trunk, discharge a high-powered Bushmaster XM-15 semi-automatic rifle, and retract the weapon without ever stepping outside the vehicle. As panic mounted throughout October, Federal task forces struggled to identify the perpetrators because traditional motives were entirely absent. The turning point in the investigation came not from the Washington area, but from a critical piece of forensic evidence left behind during their earlier multi-state movements. During the September robbery in Montgomery, Alabama, the perpetrator dropped a slick gun magazine while fleeing the scene. State forensic technicians successfully lifted a clear latent fingerprint from the surface of that magazine. When local investigators uploaded the fingerprint into national databases, it yielded an extraordinary hit. The fingerprint matched records in the federal immigration database belonging to Boyd Malvo, who had been processed by border authorities months earlier in Washington state. Simultaneously, a series of frantic phone calls made to federal tip lines by Mohammed himself, demanding money and referencing the unsolved Alabama incident, allowed analysts to link the name John Allen Mohammed to Malvo's immigration file. With the suspects finally named, federal agents traced the registration of the blue Chevrolet Caprice to Mohammed and broadcast its license plate number to law enforcement agencies nationwide. Hours after the vehicle description was publicized, a vigilant motorist and alert truck driver spotted the Caprice at the Maryland rest area and blocked the exit until tactical teams arrived. When the vehicle was searched following the arrest, investigators recovered the Bushmaster rifle, digital voice recorders, maps detailing target areas, and the modified trunk setup. The physical evidence conclusively linked Malvo and Mohammed to the string of shootings across multiple states. In 2003, Boyd Malvo stood trial in Chesapeake, Virginia, facing multiple counts of capital murder. Prosecutors presented a detailed chronological case built on ballistic evidence, fingerprint matches, and recovered digital recordings. The defense argued that Malvo was legally insane due to extreme indoctrination and psychological coercion exercised by Mohammed, contending that the teenager lacked the capacity to act independently. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Malvo guilty. Although prosecutors sought the death penalty, the jury recommended a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Malvo subsequently entered guilty pleas to additional charges in Maryland and Virginia, resulting in multiple consecutive life sentences. The legal legacy of the case evolved significantly decades later. Following historic United States Supreme Court rulings concerning juvenile sentencing standards, Virginia enacted legislation in 2020 allowing juvenile offenders serving mandatory life sentences to become eligible to petition for parole after serving 25 years. In August 2022, Malvo reached his initial milestone and was formally considered for parole under this law. The Virginia Parole Board officially denied his release, determining that his original actions were too severe and that he remained a potential risk to public safety. Boyd Malvo remains incarcerated at the Keene Mountain Correctional Center in Virginia. His case continues to stand as a stark historical study in radical psychological manipulation, showing how systemic vulnerability, isolation, and calculated influence can transform an impressionable youth into a participant in one of the nation's most notorious criminal campaigns. Case 2, Dimitrios Pagourtzis. On May 18, 2018, law enforcement officers and emergency medical teams rushed toward the campus of Santa Fe High School in Galveston County, Texas, following reports of an active shooter inside the facility. Responding officers encountered a chaotic scene as students and faculty fled the art wing, where a heavily armed individual remained barricaded inside adjoining classrooms. Tactical teams entered the building, confronting a suspect who engaged in a high-risk standoff with responding personnel. Among the first to arrive was Santa Fe Independent School District Police Officer John Barnes, who sustained severe, life-threatening injuries during an exchange of gunfire. After 30 minutes of intense negotiations with Officer Barnes and responding Galveston County Sheriff's Deputy Gary Forward, The suspect surrendered his weapons and was taken into custody. The individual removed from the campus was 17-year-old student Dimitrios Pagourtzis. Authorities quickly confirmed that the incident resulted in 10 fatalities, 8 students and 2 educators, along with 13 additional wounded survivors. Within hours, prosecutors charged Pagourtzis with capital murder and aggravated assault on a public servant. Because he was 17 years old at the time of the offense, federal legal standards made him ineligible for the death penalty, facing instead a potential sentence of life imprisonment. To understand how an active high school student planned such an action, we have to go back to the months leading up to the incident. Born in 2000, Dimitrios Pagourtzis grew up in Santa Fe, Texas, participating in local youth sports and school organizations. By his junior year of high school, however, subtle indicators of deep psychological distress and isolation began to emerge. In the weeks prior to May 2018, Pagourtzis posted images on social media accounts featuring a custom t-shirt bearing the phrase, "Born to Kill," alongside dark, symbolic artwork. Despite these disturbing digital postings, no formal reports were filed with school administrators or local law enforcement. Pagourtzis maintained a quiet demeanor at school while secretly gathering equipment. He acquired a Remington 870 shotgun and a Rossi .38 caliber revolver, both legally owned and stored by his father. Pagourtzis modified the shotgun by sawing down the barrel and stock, allowing him to conceal both firearms beneath a heavy, long black trench coat. On the morning of May 18, 2018, despite temperatures rising into the high 70s, Pagourtzis arrived at campus wearing the long trench coat. Hidden underneath were the modified shotgun, the revolver, and an extensive supply of ammunition. Inside his coat pockets, he also carried several crude, homemade explosive devices, including pipe bombs and pressure cooker bombs constructed with basic household materials. Shortly after 7:30 a.m., during the first class period, Pagourtzis bypassed morning security checks and entered the school's art complex. He walked directly into Art Lab 1 and subsequently moved into adjoining Art Lab 2, where students and teachers were actively engaged in instruction. Upon entering the rooms, Pagourtzis opened fire without warning. As students and teachers attempted to barricade doors or seek shelter behind storage cabinets, he deployed his firearms and threw several homemade explosive devices across the room. Subsequent forensic analysis revealed that due to critical assembly and fusing flaws, none of the pipe bombs or pressure cooker devices detonated, preventing further destruction. The tactical response moved swiftly. As alarm systems sounded, Officer John Barnes and Deputy Gary Forward advanced into the hallway directly outside the art complex, drawing fire away from surrounding classrooms. The officers cornered Pagourtzis inside a storage room connecting the 2 art labs, engaging in tactical communication that forced him to halt his advance until additional law enforcement units established a perimeter. During the subsequent investigation, state and federal agents thoroughly documented the scene, recovering spent shotgun shells, bullet casings, the unexploded devices, and written journals from the suspect's residence detailing his meticulous planning. Prosecutors assembled a comprehensive physical and digital case, preparing to bring Pagourtzis to trial in Galveston County. However, the legal proceedings encountered an unprecedented obstacle during pretrial preparations. In late 2019, court-appointed forensic psychiatrists evaluated Pagourtzis to assess his mental state under the legal framework known as the Dusky Standard, which requires a criminal defendant to rationally understand court proceedings and effectively assist their defense counsel. Medical experts unanimously concluded that Pagourtzis suffered from severe, persistent psychotic delusions, rendering him legally incompetent to stand trial. In November 2019, a state judge ordered Pagourtzis committed to the North Texas State Hospital in Vernon, Texas, a maximum security forensic mental health facility. Under Texas law, A criminal defendant cannot be placed on trial while legally incompetent. Over the years following his initial commitment, state medical professionals at the Vernon facility have conducted annual evaluations. In continuous court filings, treating doctors have repeatedly reported that despite intensive antipsychotic medication and clinical therapy, Pagourtzis remains severely ill, leading judges to sign formal orders recommitting him to the hospital every 12 months. In major civil proceedings concluded in August 2024, a jury allocated financial responsibility for the tragedy to Pagourtzis and an online ammunition vendor, while finding his parents not legally negligent. Today, Dimitrios Pagourtzis remains confined at North Texas State Hospital, where doctors designated him as one of the most acutely ill patients in the state facility. His criminal trial remains indefinitely suspended until his legal competency is restored, highlighting the complex intersection between severe adolescent mental illness, public safety, and the constitutional requirements of the legal system. Case 3, Paris Bennett. On the night of February 5, 2007, emergency dispatchers in Williamson County, Texas, received a calm, remarkably composed call from a suburban home in Cedar Park. The teenager on the phone reported that his 4-year-old sister was unresponsive in her bedroom. For over 10 minutes, he maintained a steady dialogue with the operator, meticulously walking through instructions to perform emergency chest compressions until first responders arrived at the residence. Emergency medical personnel rushed into the house, but their efforts were in vain. 4-year-old Ella Bennett was declared deceased at the scene. Within hours, police questioning transformed what initially appeared to be a tragic household crisis into a chilling homicide investigation. The teenager who had called 911, 13-year-old Paris Lee Bennett, was taken into custody and charged with capital murder. Because of his age, Bennett was legally ineligible for the death penalty or a mandatory sentence of life without parole under Texas juvenile statutes. Instead, he faced a unique legal framework, a 40-year maximum sentence with initial parole eligibility after serving 20 years. To understand how a 13-year-old boy came to execute a deeply calculated act of violence against a family member, we must examine the hidden psychological dynamics inside the household. Born in 1991, Paris Bennett spent his early childhood moving between locations with his mother, Charity Lee. From a young age, Bennett demonstrated extraordinary intellectual capabilities, eventually testing at a measured IQ of 141, placing him in the top fraction of 1% globally. However, beneath his polite demeanor and exceptional academic aptitude lay a dark, emerging personality structure characterized by a profound lack of empathy, intense narcissism, and a capacity for extreme calculation. As Bennett entered adolescence, subtle conflicts began to surface between him and his mother. Charity Lee, who was working tirelessly to maintain financial stability and rebuild her life after overcoming past struggles, devoted significant attention to her younger daughter, 4-year-old Ella. Rather than expressing typical sibling rivalry, Bennett processed his mother's devotion through a cold, retaliatory lens. In later law enforcement interviews and psychiatric evaluations, Bennett openly disclosed his precise motivation. He realized that taking his mother's life would bring her suffering to an end, whereas taking the life of her youngest child would force his mother to endure a lifetime of unbearable psychological torment. On the evening of February 5, 2007, Charity Lee was away from the family's Cedar Park residence working a night shift at a local restaurant. A hired babysitter was present at the home to supervise 13-year-old Paris and 4-year-old Ella. Utilizing his advanced intelligence and persuasive charm, Bennett convinced the babysitter that her services were no longer needed for the night, persuading her to leave the premises early. Once the babysitter departed, leaving Bennett alone with his sleeping sister, he set his plan into motion. He walked into 4-year-old Ella's bedroom while she was asleep and launched a deliberate, violent assault. Immediately following the attack, Bennett stepped away from the room and accessed a home computer. Digital forensic analysis later revealed that he spent approximately 2 minutes executing web searches regarding homicide techniques and forensic evidence. Once his online search concluded, Bennett picked up the telephone and dialed 911. During the subsequent 10-minute recorded call, Bennett feigned compliance with dispatcher instructions, pretending to perform CPR on his sister, while maintaining absolute emotional composure until officers knocked on the front door. When detectives began questioning Bennett at the police station, they encountered an individual who displayed no visible distress, remorse, or panic. Forensic technicians processed the crime scene, collecting computer browser histories, fingerprint evidence, and physical data from the bedroom that directly contradicted Bennett's initial statements. Facing undeniable physical and digital evidence, Bennett calmly detailed his actions and articulated his vengeful motive against his mother. In late 2007, Paris Bennett entered a guilty plea to capital murder in a Texas juvenile court. Under Texas law governing severe offenses committed by minors aged 13 to 15, the judge handed down the maximum permissible sentence, 40 years in prison. Under the Texas capital murder as a juvenile sentencing framework, Bennett was initially remanded to a high-security Texas Youth Commission facility. When he reached the age of 18, state authorities evaluated his behavior and transferred him directly into the adult state prison system, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, to serve out his term. Under Texas statutory guidelines, Bennett becomes officially eligible to petition the state parole board for release after completing 20 years of his sentence, a milestone set for 2027. The profound tragedy led Charity Lee to establish the Emerge Hope Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime, facilitating trauma recovery, and advocating for early childhood empathy education. Today, Paris Bennett remains incarcerated in a maximum security state prison in Texas, serving his 40-year term. His case stands as a terrifying case study in high IQ adolescent psychopathy, highlighting how extreme manipulation and hidden hostility can reside behind a facade of intellectual brilliance. Case 4. Joshua Phillips. On November 10, 1998, 7 days after an 8-year-old girl vanished from her suburban Jacksonville, Florida neighborhood, law enforcement officers standing outside a nearby home saw a woman burst through the front door. Screaming in shock, she flagged down a police officer stationed on the street, pointing back toward her house. Minutes later, crime scene technicians entered a 14-year-old boy's bedroom and lifted the heavy wooden pedestal frame supporting a waterbed. Beneath it lay the missing child, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton. The teenager who lived in that room, 14-year-old Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips, was taken into custody at his middle school shortly after the discovery. In 1999, a Florida jury convicted Phillips of first-degree murder. The trial judge handed down a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, making Phillips one of the youngest individuals in modern Florida history to receive a permanent life sentence. To understand how a routine afternoon play session turned into an unexpected tragedy, we must examine the restrictive atmosphere inside the Phillips home. Born in 1984, Joshua Phillips grew up in Jacksonville under an intensely strict, volatile household environment dominated by his father, Steve Phillips. According to family accounts and court testimony, the father enforced rigid domestic rules, exhibited severe anger issues, and forbade visitors when he was absent from the house. Phillips lived in constant dread of triggering his father's physical outbursts, cultivating an extreme fear of getting into trouble. Despite these hidden domestic tensions, Phillips appeared to neighbors and teachers as a quiet, ordinary student. He lived directly across the street from 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, and the two families were friendly, with the children frequently playing together in their front yards. On the afternoon of November 3, 1998, 8-year-old Maddie walked across the street to ask Phillips to play baseball in his yard. Phillips agreed, knowing his father was away. During their game, Phillips swung a baseball bat, accidentally striking Maddie hard near her eye. The impact created a severe gash, causing the young girl to cry out loudly in distress. Overwhelmed by sudden panic, Phillips prioritized one thing above all else: stopping the noise before his father returned home. Panicking that his father would hear her crying and punish him severely, Phillips dragged the injured child into his bedroom. When her crying continued, his panic escalated into a frantic attempt to silence her, striking her with the bat and inflicting fatal injuries. Driven by intense terror of discovery, Phillips pried open the wooden side panel of his waterbed frame, pushed Maddie's body into the dark hollow structure underneath, and replaced the panel. When his father arrived home moments later, Phillips acted completely normal. For the next 7 days, the Jacksonville community engaged in an exhaustive, highly publicized search for the missing child. Hundreds of volunteers, law enforcement officers, and search teams swept the surrounding neighborhoods. Throughout the entire week, Phillips maintained a calm exterior, continuing to attend school, sleeping on the waterbed every night, and even participating in community search rallies alongside Maddie's family. The turning point occurred on the morning of November 10, 1998. While Phillips was at school, his mother, Melissa Phillips, entered his bedroom to perform routine house cleaning. While tidying the room, she noticed a wet spot on the carpet near the waterbed frame, along with a small piece of metal protruding from the wooden base. Inspecting the bed, she removed the side panel and made the discovery. Overcome with shock, she ran into the street to alert officers, bringing an end to the week-long search operation and immediately identifying her son as the suspect. During subsequent police interrogations, Phillips admitted to his actions, explaining that his decisions were driven by extreme fear of his father's reaction. In 1999, prosecutors tried Phillips as an adult. The jury returned a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder, resulting in an automatic sentence of life without parole. The legal standing of the case shifted significantly following United States Supreme Court rulings in Graham v. Florida and Miller v. Alabama, which declared mandatory life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders unconstitutional. Under a new Florida statutory framework, requiring individualized resentencing hearings for juvenile offenders, Phillips returned to court in August 2017. The judge evaluated his youth, prison record, and psychological status, but ultimately reimposed a life sentence, establishing an automatic judicial review requirement after 25 years. Subsequent appellate challenges reviewed his eligibility for release. In mid-2025, after completing 25 years of incarceration, Phillips returned to a Duval County courtroom for his statutory sentencing review hearing, where state judges began evaluating his prison conduct, maturity, and potential for eventual parole eligibility. Today, Joshua Phillips remains incarcerated at Cross City Correctional Institution in Florida. His case remains a tragic example of how extreme fear, unaddressed domestic volatility, and a lack of emotional problem-solving can combine to produce catastrophic outcomes. Case 5. Lionel Tate. On March 9, 2001, a courtroom in Broward County, Florida, delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves through the American legal system. A 12-year-old boy stood quietly before a circuit judge as he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The defendant, Lionel Alexander Tate, became the youngest person in modern United States history to receive a mandatory life sentence without parole following a first-degree murder conviction. The victim was 6-year-old Tiffany Unick. The case triggered intense national debate over whether the juvenile justice system should treat young adolescents as adults when catastrophic violent events occur. To understand how a routine evening of babysitting turned into a landmark criminal prosecution, we must examine the events inside the home and the controversial legal defense that followed. Born in 1987, Lionel Tate grew up in Pembroke Pines, Florida, raised by his mother, Kathleen Grossett Tate, a Florida state trooper. Tate was a physically imposing 12-year-old, weighing over 160 pounds, nearly 3 times the size of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, a family friend who frequently visited the Tate household. On the evening of July 28, 1999, Kathleen Grossett Tate offered to babysit 6-year-old Tiffany while her mother worked a late shift. Around 10:00 p.m., Grossett Tate went upstairs to rest, leaving 12-year-old Lionel downstairs in the living room to watch television with Tiffany. According to initial statements given to police, Tate claimed that he and Tiffany were watching professional wrestling on television when they began playfully imitating the maneuvers. Tate claimed he threw Tiffany onto a sofa and placed her in a bear hug, asserting that her death was a tragic accident resulting from innocent, rough physical play. However, when medical examiners conducted a thorough autopsy on 6-year-old Tiffany, the physical evidence completely dismantled the story of accidental play. The official medical examiner's report revealed that Tiffany had sustained catastrophic internal trauma. Her injuries included a fractured skull, a lacerated liver, a broken rib, a severe brain hemorrhage, and more than 30 distinct bruises and abrasions across her body. The chief medical examiner testified that the extent of physical damage inflicted on Tiffany was equivalent to the force of a high-speed traffic collision or a fall from a 3-story building. The medical findings conclusively proved that the assault was prolonged, violent, and far beyond any rough play or accidental movement. When prosecutors charged Tate with first-degree felony murder, his defense attorney, Jim Lewis, presented a highly controversial legal strategy that quickly became known nationwide as the WWF defense. Defense counsel argued that Tate was an impressionable young boy who was simply mimicking the violent moves he watched on World Wrestling Federation television programming, lacking any intent to cause harm. Prosecutors countered that Tate's physical size, combined with the extreme level of force required to fracture a skull and lacerate an internal organ, demonstrated conscious, lethal violence. In January 2001, a jury rejected the pro wrestling defense and found Tate guilty of first-degree murder, leading directly to his mandatory life sentence without parole. The severity of the sentence sparked immediate legal challenges and public outcry regarding mandatory sentencing laws for children. In January 2004, an appeals court overturned Tate's conviction, ruling that his mental competency had not been properly evaluated prior to trial. Rather than facing a second trial, Tate accepted a plea deal offered by state prosecutors. He pled guilty to second-degree murder. His life sentence was set aside, and he was released from custody with credit for the 3 years already served. He was placed on 1 year of house arrest followed by 10 years of strict probation. However, Tate's freedom was short-lived as he repeatedly failed to abide by the terms of his community supervision. In September 2004, less than a year after his release, police arrested Tate for violating his probation by possessing a knife. The final breakdown occurred on May 23, 2005. While still under court supervision, Tate held up a pizza delivery driver at gunpoint inside a Pembroke Pines apartment, stealing 4 pizzas. In May 2006, following his conviction for armed robbery and probation violation, a judge sentenced Tate to 30 years in state prison. Today, Lionel Tate remains incarcerated within the Florida Department of Corrections. His case stands as a powerful legal case study illustrating the deep complexities of juvenile accountability, the limits of media-influenced defense theories, and the severe challenges surrounding the rehabilitation of violent young offenders. Case 6. John Jason McLaughlin. On September 24, 2003, emergency sirens echoed across the rural community of Cold Spring, Minnesota, as law enforcement vehicles converged on Ricori High School. Reports of active gunfire inside the building sent the facility into immediate lockdown, with students barricading classroom doors and seeking cover. Within minutes of arriving on campus, officers took a 15-year-old freshman into custody without further incident. Inside a hallway near the school's physical education complex, 2 students lay critically injured. 17-year-old Aaron Rowlands died shortly after the attack, while 14-year-old Seth Bartel sustained fatal injuries, passing away 16 days later at a regional medical center. The teenager arrested at the scene was 15-year-old John Jason McLaughlin. Prosecutors charged him as an adult with first-degree premeditated murder and second-degree murder. To understand how a quiet, high-achieving student brought lethal violence into his high school, we must examine the interpersonal conflicts and hidden emotional strain building inside the building. Born in 1988, John Jason McLaughlin grew up in Cold Spring, Minnesota, living in a stable home with his family. To his neighbors and elementary school teachers, McLaughlin appeared to be a soft-spoken, reserved boy with no history of disciplinary problems or violent behavior. However, as he transitioned into middle school and high school, he experienced severe social isolation and persistent interpersonal friction with peers. Throughout his freshman year at Ricori High School, McLaughlin became the target of relentless teasing and verbal harassment from fellow students. Much of the mocking focused directly on his personal appearance, specifically targeting his severe facial acne. Over time, McLaughlin developed a deep, focused resentment toward 14-year-old classmate Seth Bartel, whom he perceived as a primary source of the ongoing teasing. Rather than reporting the harassment to school administrators or confiding in his parents, McLaughlin internalized his anger, eventually deciding to seek retaliatory action against Bartel on campus. On the morning of September 24, 2003, McLaughlin arrived at Ricori High School carrying a concealed .22 caliber Colt semi-automatic handgun, along with extra ammunition, which he had taken from his home. He placed the firearm inside his hallway locker during the morning periods. Shortly before 11:30 a.m., during a passing period, McLaughlin retrieved the handgun from his locker and walked directly toward the school's weight room and physical education locker rooms, where he knew Bartel would be present. Upon locating Bartel in an exercise area, McLaughlin drew the weapon and fired his first shot, striking Bartel in the chest. As panic erupted and students scrambled for exits, a second shot struck 17-year-old Aaron Rowlands, who was standing nearby, inflicting fatal injuries. Bartel attempted to flee out of the locker room area and into an adjoining hallway. McLaughlin pursued him into the corridor, discharging another round that struck Bartel again. At that critical moment, Ricori High School physical education teacher Mark Carl stepped out of his office into the hallway. Seeing the armed student holding the handgun, Carl demonstrated extraordinary composure. Rather than retreating, Carl stepped directly into McLaughlin's line of sight, raised his hands, and addressed the teenager in a calm, authoritative voice, commanding him to drop the weapon. Faced with Carl's firm, direct intervention, McLaughlin hesitated, lowered the firearm, emptied the magazine onto the floor, and surrendered the handgun to the teacher. Carl secured the weapon and kept McLaughlin contained until law enforcement officers arrived moments later. During subsequent police interrogations and psychological evaluations, McLaughlin admitted to targeting Bartel due to the persistent teasing about his acne, expressing remorse for the loss of Rowlands, whom he acknowledged was not an intended target. In August 2005, following a bench trial in Stearns County District Court, A state judge rejected defense arguments claiming diminished mental capacity due to severe depression and emerging mental illness. The judge found McLaughlin guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Seth Bartell and second-degree murder for the death of Aaron Rowlands. The court delivered a strict legal outcome, sentencing McLaughlin to consecutive terms totaling life imprisonment, with a mandatory minimum of 30 years served before becoming eligible to petition for parole under Minnesota statutory guidelines. Today, John Jason McLaughlin remains incarcerated within the Minnesota Department of Corrections. His case stands as a sobering case study, highlighting the catastrophic consequences of unaddressed school bullying, the urgent need for early peer conflict intervention, and the life-saving impact of decisive, calm crisis management by educators. Case 7. Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper. On September 24, 2006, emergency dispatchers in Bennett County, Idaho, received a frantic call from a rural residence in Pocatello known as the Whispering Cliffs home. Family members arriving at the house had discovered 16-year-old high school student Cassie Jo Stoddart unresponsive on the living room floor. First responders rushed to the location, but their efforts were immediately halted upon entering the building. Stoddart had sustained catastrophic, fatal trauma caused by multiple sharp force instruments. Within 48 hours of the discovery, police questioning transformed what initially appeared to be an undetected home intrusion into a shocking investigation, centered directly on two of the victims' high school classmates. Detectives arrested 16-year-old Tori Michael Adamczyk and 16-year-old Brian Lee Draper, charging both as adults with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The legal proceedings resulted in mandatory sentences of life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for both teenagers. To understand how two ordinary high school students executed a deliberate ambush against a classmate, we must examine the hidden dynamic between the co-conspirators and the chilling media recording they left behind. Born in 1990, Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper grew up in Pocatello, Idaho, attending Pocatello High School. To teachers and peers, both teenagers appeared quiet and unremarkable, sharing a mutual interest in filmmaking and creative writing. However, behind closed doors, their creative partnership evolved into a dark obsession with violent cinema, particularly the 1996 horror film Scream. Over the weeks leading up to September 2006, Adamczyk and Draper began documenting their thoughts using a handheld Sony camcorder. In a series of videotaped recordings recovered by investigators, the two teenagers explicitly detailed their desire to emulate fictional film killers and establish a legacy as real-life mass murderers. On the tapes, recorded hours before the assault, they named several classmates as potential targets before settling on 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart, explicitly discussing their plan to document what they termed their first lethal act. On the evening of Friday, September 22, 2006, Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting at her aunt and uncle's home at Whispering Cliffs while they were away for the weekend. Stoddart invited her boyfriend and classmate Tori Adamczyk to come over to keep her company. Adamczyk arrived at the residence accompanied by Brian Draper around 7:00 p.m. The four teenagers hung out in the living room for roughly 2 hours. During this time, Draper walked down to the basement, quietly unlocking a rear exterior basement door to secure an undetected entry point for later that night. Around 9:00 p.m., Draper and Adamczyk announced they were leaving to go watch a movie at a local theater, exiting through the front door and leaving Stoddart and her boyfriend alone in the house. Shortly after departing, Adamczyk and Draper drove to a nearby area, changed into dark clothing, put on masks and gloves, and armed themselves with 2 large dagger-style knives they had purchased at a local surplus store. They drove back to the Whispering Cliffs residence, parked down the street, and slipped silently back into the house through the unlocked basement door. To create psychological terror, Adamczyk and Draper located the main electrical circuit breaker panel in the basement and tripped the master switch, instantly plunging the entire house into complete darkness. Upstairs, Stoddart and her boyfriend noticed the sudden power outage. When the lights went out, Stoddart's boyfriend called his mother, who offered to let him spend the night at their house. Stoddart chose to remain behind to fulfill her house-sitting duties. When her boyfriend was picked up around 10:30 p.m., Stoddart was left entirely alone in the darkened home. Moments after the boyfriend departed, Adamczyk and Draper tripped the breaker again to see if anyone remained upstairs. Hearing no movement, they crept up the basement stairs and launched a sudden, coordinated ambush in the dark living room, inflicting fatal sharp force injuries with both weapons before fleeing the scene into the night. Following the assault, the two teenagers drove into the surrounding hills, turned on their camcorder, and recorded an immediate post-crime video reaction where they celebrated their actions and discussed disposing of physical evidence. The turning point in the police investigation occurred on September 27, 2006. During initial police questioning, Adamczyk and Draper provided conflicting alibis regarding the movie they claimed to have watched. Recognizing that his story was falling apart under pressure, Draper broke down during interrogation and agreed to lead detectives to the physical evidence. Draper guided law enforcement officers to a remote, dirt-covered location in the Blackhawk Park area outside Pocatello. Using the precise directions provided, crime scene technicians recovered a buried plastic bag containing 2 dagger-style knives, sheaths, black clothing, latex gloves, a notebook with written hit lists, and the Sony camcorder containing the videotape. Forensic technicians successfully restored the deleted media on the tape, providing prosecutors with an indisputable, self-recorded record of the planning, execution, and immediate aftermath of the crime. In 2007, Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper were tried separately in Idaho District Court. Prosecutors presented the restored videotape footage, ballistic knife analyses, and DNA evidence recovered from the buried stash. In both trials, juries returned guilty verdicts for first-degree murder and conspiracy. The trial court delivered mandatory sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years for conspiracy. Subsequent state and federal appellate reviews continuously affirmed the convictions, confirming that the mandatory life terms complied with constitutional standards for juvenile offenders convicted of deliberate, premeditated murder. Today, Tori Adamczyk remains incarcerated at the Idaho State Correctional Institution in Kuna, while Brian Draper serves his sentence at the same facility. Their case stands as a chilling case study in mutual adolescent escalation, media-inspired violence, and the critical role of digital forensics in solving complex criminal investigations. Case 8 Kip Kinkle. On May 21, 1998, emergency calls flooded the police dispatch center in Springfield, Oregon, reporting active gunfire inside the cafeteria at Thurston High School. Hundreds of terrified students scattered across the campus as a shooter moved through the building discharging weapons into the crowded room. 2 students, 16-year-old Ben Walker and 14-year-old Kendra Edwards, sustained fatal injuries during the onslaught, while 25 other students suffered bullet wounds. Within minutes, responding officers entered the cafeteria, finding that several courageous students had already tackled the gunman to the floor, disarmed him, and pinned him down until police arrived. The individual taken into custody was 15-year-old Kipland Philip Kinkle. Shortly after his arrest, police officers dispatched to his family residence uncovered a second crime scene. Kinkle's parents, William and Faith Kinkle, lay deceased inside their home. Prosecutors charged Kinkle as an adult with 4 counts of murder, 26 counts of attempted murder, and numerous associated felonies. In November 1999, Kinkle received a sentence totaling 111 years and 8 months in prison without the possibility of parole. To understand how a 15-year-old boy carried out a multi-stage spree, we must examine his severe, unaddressed mental health struggles and the escalating crisis in the days prior. Born in 1982, Kip Kinkle grew up in Springfield, Oregon, raised by two respected high school language teachers, William and Faith Kinkle. To neighbors and classmates, Kinkle appeared to be an ordinary suburban teenager. However, away from public view, Kinkle suffered from severe, untreated psychiatric symptoms, including paranoid schizophrenia and intense auditory hallucinations, describing voices inside his head that commanded him to commit violent acts. As Kinkle entered adolescence, his psychological condition deteriorated sharply. He developed an obsessive fixation on firearms, tactical knives, and manufacturing homemade explosives, filling his bedroom with instructional manuals and chemical materials. Recognizing their son's troubling emotional outbursts, his parents sought medical assistance, enrolling him in therapy and securing prescriptions for antidepressant medication. Despite these parental efforts, Kinkle's auditory hallucinations persisted, and his access to weapons increased as his father purchased firearms for him in an effort to bond over target shooting. The turning point occurred on Wednesday, May 20, 1998. That morning, Kinkle purchased a stolen .32 caliber Beretta handgun from a fellow student on the Thurston High School campus. School administrators received a tip regarding the transaction, conducted a search, and recovered the stolen firearm from Kinkle's locker. Police officers arrested Kinkle, brought him to the station for processing, and released him into the custody of his father, William Kinkle. School authorities immediately suspended Kinkle, initiating formal expulsion proceedings. Upon returning to their home, William Kinkle sat at the kitchen counter, deeply distressed over his son's arrest and uncertain of how to manage the impending legal and academic consequences. Minutes later, Kinkle retrieved a .22 caliber rifle from his bedroom, stepped up behind his father and fired a fatal shot. Kinkle then waited inside the quiet house for several hours until his mother, Faith Kinkle, arrived home from grocery shopping. As she walked up the stairs from the garage, Kinkle confronted her and fired multiple fatal shots, later telling investigators that he killed his parents to spare them the embarrassment and grief of his criminal arrest. Kinkle spent the remainder of that night alone in the house, playing continuous music and preparing his gear for the following morning. On Thursday, May 21, 1998, Kinkle put on a long trench coat concealing 3 firearms, a 9 Ruger rifle, a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, and a Glock 9 handgun, along with 1,127 rounds of live ammunition tucked into his clothing and taped to his body. He drove his mother's car to Thurston High School, parked down the street, and walked onto campus shortly before 8:00 a.m. Kinkle entered the hallway leading to the cafeteria, discharging 2 shots that struck fleeing students, before stepping directly into the crowded cafeteria where over 400 students were gathered before classes. Kinkle opened fire continuously into the crowd, discharging dozens of rounds in rapid succession. As panic erupted, students dove beneath tables or rushed toward side exits. Kinkle exhausted his primary rifle and drew his handgun to continue firing. At that critical moment, 16-year-old student Jacob Riker, despite having already sustained a bullet wound to his chest, recognized that Kinkle's weapon was empty or jamming during a reload attempt. Demonstrating extraordinary bravery, Riker charged directly at Kinkle, tackling him to the cafeteria floor. Several other students, including Adam Walinski, Doug and Wesley Ure, and Ryan Attebury, immediately joined Riker, throwing their weight onto Kinkle, securing his hands, and wresting the handgun away. Despite Kinkle drawing a hidden knife and injuring Riker during the struggle, the students held him pinned until law enforcement officers took control of the scene. During subsequent police interrogations, Kinkle made full confessions, detailing the auditory hallucinations that had plagued him for years. In September 1999, Kinkle entered a plea of guilty to 4 counts of murder and no contest to 26 counts of attempted murder. In November 1999, an Oregon Circuit judge imposed consecutive sentences totaling 111 years and 8 months without parole, ensuring Kinkle would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. Subsequent state and federal appeals consistently upheld the sentence structure, determining that his actions across 2 separate locations warranted cumulative adult sentencing. Today, Kip Kinkle remains incarcerated within the Oregon Department of Corrections. His case stands as a tragic study in severe adolescent mental illness, highlighting the dangerous intersection of untreated psychosis, easy access to firearms, and the heroic intervention of bystanders during an active crisis. Case 9. Eric Smith. On August 2, 1993, the quiet summer tranquility of Savona, a small village in Steuben County, New York, was shattered when 4-year-old Derek Roby failed to arrive at his local summer day camp. The boy's mother had permitted him to walk the short distance alone, a mere block and a half from their home, in a community where violent crime was virtually non-existent. When camp counselors realized Derek had never arrived, emergency search teams were immediately assembled. Hours later, volunteers discovered the child's lifeless body in a wooded brush area near Palmentier Park, a shortcut along the route to the recreation center. The crime scene revealed that the young victim had sustained severe, fatal blunt force trauma. Within days, law enforcement questioning led to an arrest that stunned the nation. The individual responsible was not a seasoned adult offender, but 13-year-old local resident Eric M. Smith. Charged as an adult with second-degree murder, Smith faced a potential sentence of 9 years to life imprisonment. To understand how a 13-year-old came to commit an act of catastrophic violence against a toddler, we must examine Smith's background, personal struggles, and the environment in which he grew up. Born in January 1980, Eric Smith spent his childhood in Savona, New York. From an early age, Smith stood out due to distinct physical characteristics, including low-set, protruding ears, thick eyeglasses, a freckled complexion, and bright red hair. In addition to these physical traits, Smith dealt with complex developmental challenges and was prescribed medication for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Throughout his elementary and middle school years, Smith became the target of relentless, severe bullying from neighborhood peers and classmates. He was subjected to constant verbal ridicule regarding his appearance, leading to profound emotional isolation, low self-esteem, and severe, unaddressed internal aggression. Rather than receiving effective psychiatric intervention to manage his deep-seated resentment, Smith internalized his frustration, developing a hostility that ultimately found an outlet against a completely defenseless target. On the morning of Monday, August 2, 1993, 4-year-old Derek Roby left his house at approximately 8:45 a.m. to walk to the summer day camp at Palmentier Park. Simultaneously, 13-year-old Eric Smith was riding his bicycle along the same route. Smith observed the young boy walking alone near the entrance of a wooded shortcut path that cut through the park. Recognizing that no adults or witnesses were nearby, Smith approached Derek, engaged him in brief conversation, and persuaded the toddler to follow him off the main sidewalk and into the dense, secluded brush of the park. Once concealed inside the wooded area, Smith launched a sudden, deliberate assault on the 4-year-old, using heavy rocks found on the ground to inflict fatal injuries. Immediately following the attack, Smith left the park, remounted his bicycle, and returned home, behaving normally for the remainder of the day. The discovery of Derek Roby's body later that afternoon triggered a massive multi-agency investigation led by the New York State Police and local authorities. Investigators initially focused on identifying adult suspects in the area, setting up checkpoints, and interviewing local residents. The breakthrough came 5 days into the investigation. On August 7, 1993, during routine canvas interviews conducted by state police investigators, Smith and his family were questioned. Recognizing discrepancies in Smith's timeline, investigators pressed further. Overcome by the weight of the inquiry, Smith confessed to his mother and officers, admitting that he had lured Derek into the woods and executed the fatal attack. In August 1994, Smith stood trial as an adult in Steuben County Court, facing a charge of second-degree murder. Defense attorneys presented testimony from mental health experts arguing that Smith suffered from intermittent explosive disorder, asserting that his severe emotional distress and brain chemistry diminished his capacity to control his actions. However, prosecution experts demonstrated that Smith's actions, luring the child into seclusion, concealing the body, and attempting to hide his involvement, proved clear premeditation and an understanding of the wrongfulness of his conduct. The jury found Smith guilty of second-degree murder. The trial judge imposed the maximum statutory sentence for a juvenile offender tried as an adult at that time, 9 years to life in state prison. Smith was initially remanded to a high-security juvenile facility operated by the New York State Division for Youth, before being transferred to an adult maximum security prison upon reaching his 18th birthday. For nearly 3 decades, Smith remained incarcerated within the New York State prison system. Beginning in 2002, when he first became eligible for parole after serving his minimum 9-year requirement, Smith appeared repeatedly before the New York State Board of Parole. Over the course of 20 years, the parole board officially denied Smith's release 10 consecutive times. During these hearings, board members cited the extreme brutality of the crime, strong resistance from the victim's family and community, and concerns regarding public safety. In later parole appearances, a mature Smith expressed deep remorse, detailing how years of unaddressed bullying, poor coping mechanisms, and pent-up rage had driven his actions as a teenager. The legal landscape finally shifted during his 11th parole review. In October 2021, after serving 28 years in prison, the New York State Board of Parole granted Smith's request for release, determining that he had maintained a clean disciplinary record, completed extensive educational and vocational programs, and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. In February 2022, 42-year-old Eric Smith was officially released from custody on lifetime parole supervision. Under strict release conditions approved by state authorities, Smith relocated to Queens, New York, where he entered community supervision, subject to mandatory curfew, employment monitoring, and ongoing psychological evaluations. Today, Eric Smith remains under lifetime parole supervision. His case continues to serve as an enduring study in juvenile justice, highlighting the complex balance between addressing severe adolescent bullying, recognizing early warning signs of extreme aggression, and weighing long-term rehabilitation against community accountability. Case 10, Michael Carneal. On the morning of December 1, 1997, a tragic event unfolded inside the lobby of Heath High School in West Paducah, Kentucky. Shortly before 7:45 a.m., as students gathered before morning classes, a series of gunshots echoed through the building, instantly transforming a peaceful morning into a scene of chaotic terror. Within seconds, 8 students fell to the ground. 3 young girls, 14-year-old Nicole Hadley, 17-year-old Jessica James, and 14-year-old Melissa Barnett, sustained fatal injuries. 5 other students were wounded, including 15-year-old Melissa "Missy" Jenkins, who suffered a catastrophic spinal injury that left her permanently paralyzed from the chest down. Moments after the shooting ceased, the gunman dropped his weapon, removed his earplugs, and surrendered to the school's principal, Tim Adams. The 14-year-old freshman taken into custody was Michael Carneal. Prosecutors charged Carneal as an adult with 3 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, and burglary. In 1999, Carneal received a sentence of life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 25 years. To understand how a 14-year-old student executed a planned attack against his peers, we must examine the weeks of secret preparations and the mechanics of that fateful morning. Born in 1983, Michael Carneal grew up in West Paducah, Kentucky, raised in a respected middle-class family. His father was a prominent local attorney. To teachers and neighbors, Carneal appeared to be a quiet, small-statured boy who engaged in typical school activities. However, behind his reserved exterior, Carneal struggled with severe social anxiety, difficulty fitting in with peers, and intense feelings of rejection. He became the subject of persistent teasing by classmates, which fueled a growing resentment and an obsession with obtaining weapons to assert power over those he perceived as his tormentors. In the weeks leading up to December 1997, Carneal initiated a series of thefts to assemble an arsenal. He stole a .22 caliber Ruger pistol and a target rifle from a neighbor's garage, along with 2 shotguns and a .22 caliber Ruger semi-automatic rifle from his own family's home, accumulating hundreds of rounds of ammunition. On Thanksgiving weekend, Carneal stored the weapons in his bedroom. On the morning of Monday, December 1, 1997, Carneal wrapped the long guns tightly inside a blanket, securing them with tape. When classmates on the school bus asked about the bulky bundle he was carrying onto campus, Carneal offered a calm, plausible cover story, claiming the wrapped items were props for an upcoming science project. Carneal arrived at Heath High School shortly before 7:30 a.m., carrying the wrapped bundle and a backpack containing the loaded handguns and extra box ammunition. He walked into the main lobby, where an informal student prayer group consisting of roughly 30 students was standing in a circle, holding hands and finishing their morning devotion. Carneal walked to the edge of the lobby, placed foam earplugs into his ears to muffle the sound, drew the .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol from his backpack, and began firing directly into the circle of students. He discharged 8 rounds in rapid succession, aiming at the heads and upper torsos of those standing in the circle. The sudden onslaught created immediate panic as students collapsed and others scrambled for cover in nearby hallways. 5 students sustained non-fatal injuries, including Missy Jenkins, who was struck in the spine. Upon firing his 8th round, Carneal dropped the handgun onto the lobby floor, took off his earplugs, and raised his hands as Principal Tim Adams approached him. Carneal reportedly expressed immediate fear and panic, asking the principal to kill him as he was taken into custody without further resistance. During subsequent interrogations and psychological evaluations, Carneal confessed to the shooting, detailing his feelings of social isolation and his desire to intimidate those who had picked on him. Psychiatric experts evaluated Carneal, diagnosing him with early-onset paranoid schizophrenia and depression. In October 1998, Carneal entered a plea of guilty, but mentally ill to 3 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder and burglary. Under Kentucky law at the time, the judge imposed a life sentence with statutory parole eligibility set at 25 years, the maximum permissible penalty for a 14-year-old offender. Carneal was initially placed in a juvenile facility before being transferred to the Kentucky State Penitentiary upon turning 18, where he received ongoing psychiatric treatment and antipsychotic medication for his condition. The legal standing of the case reached a historic milestone 25 years later. In September 2022, 50-year-old Carneal appeared before the Kentucky Parole Board for his initial parole hearing, his first statutory opportunity to request release. During the emotional proceedings, survivors of the attack, including paralyzed survivor Missy Jenkins, delivered powerful testimony, describing the lifelong physical and psychological impact of the shooting and urging the board to keep Carneal incarcerated. Medical experts presented testimony regarding Carneal's ongoing struggle with auditory hallucinations and mental illness when not under strict institutional care. Following the testimony, the Kentucky Parole Board rendered a unanimous verdict, officially denying Carneal parole and issuing a full deferral. This legal outcome ensured that Carneal will never have another parole hearing, ordering him to spend the remainder of his natural life in prison. Today, Michael Carneal remains incarcerated within the Kentucky Department of Corrections. His case stands as a tragic study in adolescent mental health, highlighting the dangers of unaddressed bullying, the critical necessity of secure firearm storage, and the enduring impact of violent crimes on communities and survivors.